carbohydrates we talked about, lactose, but we also talked about a specific category of carbohydrates that were really interesting. Can anybody tell me what those were?
Oligos,
HMOs?
oligosaccharides.
Excellent. Oligosaccharides, human milk oligosaccharides. The abbreviation is HMO. Another word for that is glycans. But so HMOs, and they're interesting because it's a biological component of human milk that cannot be replicated in formula at all and has big effect on the immune system and immune function in kids. Okay, so then we talked about protein, and so mentioned lactoferrin, which has some immune component to it. And now we're starting with lipids. So note that lipids make up about 50% of the calories. So infants eat a high fat diet. And once they go from having 100% breast milk to starting to add more foods, this will change because they won't eat foods this high in fat after that, but this is their normal fat intake. The quantity of lipid in the milk varies with the time of day. So in the morning, there may be more water. At the middle of the night, there may be more higher in fat. So it changes depending on the time of day, and also during a feeding. So during the beginning, when a baby first gets put on the breast, the first fluid that it gets is thinner and not as high in fat. So it helps provide the needs for water. So it makes them satisfies their thirst. And then the milk, if they continue to nurse on that breast, then the milk then becomes thicker with lipids, and that helps them get full. Okay, so oftentimes a mom may feed the baby only on one breast during a feeding, or depending if the baby's still hungry, then go to the other breast. But it's important for her not to just top off both sides, or it's mostly water, but to make sure that the baby gets, you're never going to empty your breast completely because they're always making milk, but get back and get the fat. So the quality is really important. The quality of the fats are determined by maternal diet. Many things about maternal diet don't have a big impact on breast milk composition. If she doesn't eat it all, of course it will, but within a normal diet, what really has a big impact is the type of lipids that she consumes. And in particular, and I'll talk about this later when we get to pregnancy as well, but omega-3 fatty acids. I know you remember that you have your short and long chain fatty acids. Omega-6 fatty acids are the ones that are found in vegetable oils and nuts and seeds, and omega-3 fatty acids, especially the long chain ones, are found primarily in fish. And we'll go into more detail about food sources in the pregnancy lecture, but just want to remind you that. So it's and the amount of DHA in her milk can have an effect on visual acuity and cognitive development of the infant. So it's important. It's an important nutrient. Now, another really interesting, there you go. Another very interesting feature of human milk, the lipids in human milk, has to do with the form that they're found in. Now, this isn't, I don't believe this is covered in your book, but I want to make sure you get that. So let's think again about the secretory cell. Remember, this is the cell in the alveolus. It's a cuboidal cell. It's secreting milk components. Remember, we talked last time about 5 different ways materials can get from the cell or between the cell into the milk itself. Okay, so here's an image of one of these cells, and this is showing from the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, you're getting a ball of fat here. Now, what's interesting is the fat doesn't just come out like somebody just poured, oil in the breast milk. Instead, it's surrounded by a membrane, and it's not like a cell membrane, but more like a coating of lipids and proteins, which is similar to lipoproteins. Do you remember back to how we transport fat in the blood? Do you remember chylomicrons, HDL, LDL, cholesterol, how we carry our fats in the bloodstream? Do you remember that? Somebody say.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. That's very cool. Okay, so yeah, I know we go into detail about it in physiology. So this is how the milk is the fat in the milk. This is the kind of form it's in the milk itself. So if you're making human milk, there's a bilayer here, or if you're making a lipid around the layer around the lipids. If you're consuming infant formula, you do pour oil into the mixture, just like a cake batter or something, and then put an emulsifier in it so it stays suspended. But the form is really different. And why this matters is this form may affect the intestinal development, cognition, and cardiovascular health. So this is some of the components, the way that the lipids are more able to transfer nutrients and their functionality. They're more functional than if you just pour an oil into this an ingredient. So this is called the milk fat globule membrane. Okay. Now the next part, I'm going to talk about the micronutrients. What's important here, notice that I have not listed every micronutrient in the world, and we didn't go into detail. We didn't talk about fiber, which is not an issue for infants. We're not talking about thiamine, riboflavin, niacin. There's so many vitamins and minerals that I'm not discussing here. I've chosen to talk about 4. The reason that I'm talking about 4 is because these are the nutrients that can be an issue with breastfed infants. Now I'm going to remind you again to take notes, because I put words here on the slide, but my explanations are intended for you to write them down. That helps you learn. Studies show over and over again that if you write while you're learning, you're a lot more likely to keep that information and be able to access it later. So let me start over. Okay, so for each stage of the lifespan, particular nutrients are important. For example, when we get to pregnancy, there'll be certain nutrients there that would really stand out, like folic acid. Well, with respect to breastfeeding infants, these 4 nutrients are important. And I'll explain, I have a slide for each one of these to explain it. It was pretty interesting. So vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin B12, and iron are the micronutrients that we're going to talk about. Okay. Oh no, ignore that. I shouldn't have a sound on there. I didn't notice. All right, so vitamin D, before we get started, tell me what the primary function of vitamin, now vitamin D has a lot of functions, but what's the most well-known function of vitamin D? Bone development? Right, it's important for bone development. And vitamin D works by facilitating absorption of calcium and retention of calcium. It has a lot of different ways that it works. But the bottom line is it's important for bone structure. Okay, so it's, and so here we are, we're growing, this infant is growing a skeleton. Okay, so it's gonna, these bones, for example, what they do is they don't just stretch out, right? They get broken down and remodeled and broken down and remodeled over and over again. So they change. So an infant's arm is this small, and when it's, later on, when it's adult, the forearm is that long. So you need to have your nutrients that are required for bone synthesis working. So then here's a problem. Vitamin D is needed for growth and development and growth of the skeletal system, but it is naturally low in human milk. This is actually a really unique situation. Human milk is good with just about everything else, except maybe not enough iron later, but later on, closer to 4 to 6 months. But vitamin D is not found in high levels, so we have some recommendations. I think this is the only slide that makes noise. All right, so the vitamin D status is going to vary with diet and sunshine exposure. I'm pretty much aware, pretty sure that you guys are aware of this. And infants, the disease associated with vitamin C deficiency is rickets. And this is more common among exclusively breastfed infants, okay, because milk is low, limited sunlight exposure. Now, we're really not supposed to take kids outside and get them a sunburn anyway, but think about it, in some small exposure to the arms and the head when you walk around with them is a good idea. But think about winter months. Think about living in Canada, for example, or Chicago in the winter. There's not going to be any sun exposure in a situation like that. So it depends on the situation. Someone could be indoors all the time too. And also darker skin is protective of interferes with the absorption and synthesis of vitamin D. So people with darker skin are at increased risk for having kids with low vitamin D status. So what do we do about it? This is well known. This is a well-known public health issue. The recommendations are the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 400 IU per day beginning shortly after birth. So this is a supplement recommendation that's standard. Everybody should do it. What's interesting is a lot of people don't even know about this because if their healthcare providers don't bring it up, they're not going to know. So this is something that's really helpful for healthcare professionals in nutrition to be able to tell people. Now, how do you give them vitamin D? There's a variety of ways to do that. I have mixed feelings about it because some of them, they have them in droppers, right? There's droplets you can buy on Amazon. You can buy vitamin D that's in a dropper. The thing about the dropper is sometimes they put flavoring in them. So we're worried about what the infants are learning about taste, and yet they have only breast milk, and then they get into having something like, Tylenol or vitamin D or something that has some sweet stuff in it. So it's a little weird, but or there are some droplets that you can actually put on the mom's nipple right before they nurse, and that'll transfer the vitamin D, and it's less of a taste fluid type thing. This is very interesting though. This next piece is, instead, if you don't want to go this route, mom can take supplements. For a long time, we didn't know if maternal supplementation of vitamin D would transfer to milk, but it does. And studies showed that 6,400 IUs per day will provide enough vitamin D in the milk for the infant. Okay, any questions on this? Got it? Right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it says per day, so I'm assuming this just means while being breastfed, like they would just keep doing the 400 IU per day until they're done breastfeeding?
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, the guidelines, I don't have them completed here because when I talk about the infant and toddler diet, I'll bring it back up again. But when this is up until about age 1, and it's a little mushy here, but around age 1 in the United States, a lot of people stop breastfeeding and the kids will start drinking milk. If they consume milk, then they'll get enough from milk. But if they don't, some people choose not to provide cow milk, which, I don't have an opinion about that really, that's fine. But you got to make sure you get vitamin D from somewhere. So this is protected properly, at least until 6 months, and I would say till a year, until the diet provides enough vitamin D. And think about it, milk, it's a fortified nutrient in there too. It doesn't occur naturally. Vitamin D is hard to get from diet. Okay, what is the function of vitamin K?
There was a question in the chat. Somebody asked, do you get enough calcium from almond milk?
Thank you for bringing that up, Kristen. For some reason, I guess I'm not looking at the chat, so I can focus here, but thank you. You need to look at the particular product. Some products are fortified, like some soy products are fortified. I imagine almond milk is fortified, but I'm not sure. So I would always look for that. Yeah, I also wanted to say to be careful about substituting items like almond milk for cow milk, because almond milk is really low in protein and it can be really sweet in comparison. And so it's not really as nutritious as milk when you switch the infant from breastfeeding or formula to milk, which you do at a year. Okay, that's when that happens. So almond milk can, if the kid's allergic to dairy and you want to have some milk on their cereal, that's fine, but don't consider it to be the same nutritional powerhouse that milk is.
Now, are you saying milk as in whole milk or skim milk? What type of milk specifically are you referring to?
Okay, so let me clarify something here. This lecture is just on lactation, so it has to do with breast milk and the infant needs here. I'm going to pull this back in again, and I'm going to have a section on infant diet and infant requirements, and going from infancy to year 1 to year 2. Okay, at that point, then I'll be very clear about when what matters when and what type of milk. So I have absolutely have that covered. So traditionally what's done in the United States, to answer your question, is whole, usually the recommendation is whole milk for at least a year. And I can talk about that for a really long time and go down a rabbit hole because we're worried about fat in this country, but it seems like whole milk may actually be a better choice for kids than low fat or skim milk when they start drinking milk. Low fat milk is really high in protein and may stimulate growth more than you want. And so whole milk fills them up, may stop them from eating, junk food and stuff like that. So but anyway, to answer your question, I'll get into this in more depth. Okay, so why is newborns have a risk for low vitamin K status? It's called vitamin K deficiency bleeding. Do you remember what vitamin, this gives it away. Do you remember what vitamin K is for primarily?
Blood clotting.
Absolutely, blood clotting. It has other functions, but this is the big one here. And so an infant at birth is just not ready to deal with the needs for vitamin K. Okay, in some cases, well, in reality, they don't get much across the placenta and their intestines. Sterile is not really the right word because there may be some bacteria there, but they're not making vitamin K. In adults, we do make vitamin K, and maybe 10% of our vitamin K that we need is produced by bacteria in our gut, and then we absorb it, but this isn't true for infants. They're not ready yet. And then also the vitamin K cycle, where you get some vitamin K and then you recycle it and use it again, is not mature. So in infants, they're just not metabolically ready to deal with vitamin K. And there's some risk factors, or vitamin K shortage. There's some risk factors. If mom is taking things that may affect her blood clotting, aspirin, for example, then that's going to affect blood clotting, and then aspirin can make her be more likely to bleed during childbirth, and may also transfer the infant and make them more likely to hemorrhage or bleed. So think about what infants go through the birthing process. They may spend a good hour or even two, unfortunately, in the birth canal. Their heads are squished. Have you ever seen a newborn baby that has like a cone head? Because especially the first child that a person has, it's not that easy to get that head through the vagina, and so the bones actually on the top of the head slip past each other just a little bit to allow that to happen. It's a natural process, but it can also be a little traumatic, and so you want to be able to not bleed and then bleed out and have hemorrhaging occur. So a newborn, especially if they're premature or they have low birth weight or the difficult birth and exclusive breastfeeding, these are the guys that are at more risk. Now, we have in our country a movement to try not to go along with public health recommendations, such as, well, I don't want to take, parents might go, I don't want my kid to have that shot because I'm worried that that's not safe. Or I don't want my kid to have vaccinations. Right now, people that don't even know about it yet are saying, I'm not sure I'll take the COVID vaccine, because I'm sure it won't work. And a lot of damage has been done to the vaccination movement. And that damage came from lies where people said that with vaccinations that they were associated with autism. Not true. It's absolutely been debunked. It's not true. It is absolutely not true. Yet people use that all the time, and many people in our country now have decided to just have do whatever they want and not believe public health. And so vitamin K, this happens with vitamin K as well. And I used to have a study on the next slide here, but I took it off because it's a few years old, that followed some people in Tennessee that were refusing the vitamin K shot. And some of the kids experienced this hemorrhaging in the brain. So it wasn't a huge number, it was just a handful, but it does happen if people deny this. This is actually not a nutrition thing because it's a shot, but it's because it's a nutrient. It doesn't have to do with the diet, but because it's a nutrient, we'll talk about it. Okay.
Another question in the comments about aspirin, and if the maternal risk factors are only if there's an excess amount of aspirin.
No, actually, aspirin is contraindicated before surgery anyway. If you're going to have surgery, they may tell you not to eat certain foods and not to take anticoagulants because people want to be able to control bleeding during surgery. During childbirth is the same thing. Moms are at risk for hemorrhaging. during childbirth. There can be a placental tear at the end of the birth, and so she can bleed out. So the more, if she's taking anticoagulants, that can increase that risk. So I'm pretty sure aspirin and also Advil are on the no list prior to surgeries. It's a good question. Okay, hold on 1 second. I apologize, my husband's washing dishes and it's too loud. Okay, it's cool that he's doing the dishes. Okay, so potential outcomes. Oh, wait. Yeah, I went on to the next slide. Okay, we good with vitamin K? Is everybody clear?
Yes.
Okay. You can also please be happy to interrupt me and ask a question. I enjoy talking to people more than just running through a monologue. So I'm happy to do it either way. So please don't feel shy about asking a question. As long as Kristen can monitor the chat, that works really well too. But just don't be shy about talking, please. I like to know you're there. Okay, so B12 is very interesting. An infant is at risk for B12 deficiency because of several different maternal situations. One, if she is a strict vegetarian or more likely a vegan. Why would that diet interfere with her vitamin B12 status?
Is B12, it's usually found more in animal meat and products?
It is only found in products of animal origin or supplemented products. An exception is tempeh, which because of the process of fermenting, it has a little B12 in it. But mostly, it's hard to get enough B12 eating if you don't eat eggs, milk, any dairy products, any products like that, any meat, fish, poultry. It's hard to get enough.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Aren't most people deficient in B12 regardless of vegetarian or vegan, but they only get B12 because animals are given B12?
Oh, no. No. Okay, the part of that's right. So most of us are not deficient. People don't really face deficiency in B12 unless they have some metabolic conditions, which are list these here, or they're older. Like at the age of 50, you are not as good as absorbing B12. And so then it's recommended, that's one of those nutrients it's recommended that you actually take them as a supplement. And we'll get to this when we get to older adults. So it is recommended as a supplement. But most people across the board have pretty good B12 status. They get it from eating animals, and animals get it from they have in their stomachs bacteria that synthesize B12. So that B12 ends up getting into their flesh and into their stuff, right? And so that we eat that, and that's how we get it. Okay.
Somebody in the comments asked, what about nutritional yeast for B12?
Yeah, I had that on my slide before and I took it out. If you want to try a nutritional yeast, you need to be careful that it specifically has B12 in it, because most of them don't. So it would be a unique situation. It's the same as asking about does almond milk provide vitamin D? You better know what product you're looking at. So in this case, you better know what product you're looking at. Okay, so I have some more advice on this slide. This is slide 1. I'm kind of talking about the problem. In the next slide, we'll talk about dietary and supplement recommendations on this. But I'm glad y'all are interested, because this is very interesting. Whenever someone's a vegan and they're pregnant, I feel very concerned about talking to them about some nutrients. This isn't the only nutrient that can be an issue. Of course, omega-3 fats are an issue as well, but we'll talk about that later too, when we talk about pregnancy. Okay, so mom could also have pernicious anemia or celiac disease. And this is this pernicious anemia is basically full-blown vitamin B12 deficiency, and it can be caused by diet or also some genetic components. So she could have biologically more likely to be anemic because of B12 deficiency, or celiac disease, which is going to interfere with absorption of nutrients. Okay, so those are so this is another risk factor if she happens to have these conditions. Now, another one that's really interesting is, and this is becoming more common, is if mom has had or mom has had gastric bypass surgery. The bypass surgery, if y'all remember, I know you've talked about this in your classes, but basically the stomach's bypassed, right? So we don't have this big volume of stomach anymore. The stomach's really important in processing vitamin B12. We produce acid in the stomach, and we produce intrinsic factor, and those things affect vitamin B12 status and absorption. And if the stomach's not working in terms of producing the acid, then her status for vitamin B12 can be really low. And then also, if she's taking certain medications, proton pump inhibitors, this is one of the more common drugs taken in the world. This is a drug that decreases stomach acid. For people that have gastritis or ulcers or just stomach pain, they'll often take these, and that can interfere with B12 absorption too. So these are the risk factors: mom's diet or her health or medication, and what happens for the infant. Now bear in mind, if these things have to do with her nutritional status. So during pregnancy, the infant probably wasn't getting enough B12. And then afterwards, the milk is going to be low in B12. Okay, so if that's the case, then the infant is getting a deficient diet. And at around 3 to 6 months, you might see seizures, apathy, lethargy, anemia, developmental delay, failure to thrive. Failure to thrive is a condition in which infants don't grow as recommended. Infants and children don't grow as recommended. So this is really serious.
Is there a toxic level of consumption of vitamin B12?
No, this is one of the so interesting things about it, that some of the supplements have, I take B12 because I'm way over 50, okay, and some of the supplements, they'll have 2,000 micrograms in them, and the DRI is like 2 something, depending on the age. So that's way more than you need, but there's been no documentation of problems. So, okay, so she needs 2.6 micrograms per day, which is not very much. But she needs to know that, it won't work from plant foods. This is where you get vitamin D. And if you're a vegan, you can do multivitamins, take a vitamin B12 supplement by itself. This is my home candy because it's actually got a little tiny bit of cherry flavor in it. And then fortified cereals, soy beverages, if these things are fortified. Okay, so that's the answer. So being a vegan and pregnant is contraindicated without being careful. Okay, so the last slide in this presentation is about iron. I will talk about iron all semester because it is one of those nutrients that pops up just about for every age group, and it's absolutely critical in terms of health status. It's internationally one of the biggest problems is iron status, anemia secondary to poor iron status. So anemia is important. Let's look at the slide stuff I have here. So iron in human milk is bioavailable. There's not a lot of it, but it's bound to lactoferrin, which we talked about, and that binds iron and helps deliver it to the infant. Infant iron deficiency is not very common, but they can develop it as toddlers. But the infant stores can go down. So if iron deficiency occurs, that can affect, this is so important, iron deficiency in the infant during this first few months can permanently affect cognitive development. And what that means is basically lower IQ scores. There may be some behavioral issues and more like ADHD or attention deficit type behaviors where they're having trouble understanding if it's a hyperactive behavior or if it's an iron deficiency issue. And so this is one of those points where understanding the importance of iron can make a big difference in the life of families. So, and here's the deal, they're usually born with enough iron to last 4 to 6 months. So we recommend starting food at 6 months. I'll talk about iron again when I zero in on the infant diet and not just talk about lactation. Okay, so, but I have a baby food meat here. Remember, I come from a world of the pro-vegetarian, yet baby food meat can be very helpful for infants that have poor iron status, but so can fortified cereals. They're not ready for that food yet, though. This would be a weaning food, right, around 6 months or later. Anybody else? We'll talk about iron again and again.
We had another question in the comments. Do most vitamins take Do most vitamins taken from multivitamins get absorbed and transported into the milk?
The milk is going to reflect the it's going to have pretty much standard amounts of nutrients in it. So if you take a whole lot of thiamine, the milk is not going to have too much thiamine because your body's going to clear it, right? So if you take extra amounts, it's the milk reflects basically maternal plasma, and her plasma is regulated. The amount of nutrients in her plasma is regulated by many factors. So she's not, when you take something, levels may go up and then come back down again. So it wouldn't make the milk particularly high. It's not like you're storing up a supplement and the milk's getting richer and richer with nutrients. She needs enough nutrients, but then the milk, as long as she's meeting her nutrient needs, the milk will be fine, but it doesn't turn into a high dose supplement itself. That work?
Yeah, I just wanted to build off of that question because it says that if there's a vitamin D deficiency, that the mom should take 6,400 IUs per day. But for the baby, direct supplement should only be given in amounts of 400 IUs per day. So I just thought that it was interesting that there's a 6,000 IU difference between what a mother should take and what a baby is getting. And so
that's a great comment. It's very true. And they used to try, there have been many studies, and y'all, just to be clear, that she's talking about vitamin D, which is a couple slides back. Okay, so, but because, vitamin B12 levels and iron levels, no, let me go back to your example there. Maybe, oh shoot. Yeah, that didn't work. Okay, let me just talk then, since I bombed this. What happens with vitamin D is they tried supplementing mothers with different amounts of vitamin D, and actually that amount, 6,400, is over the UL. All right, so it's over the UL, but it doesn't seem to cause any problems. So, but it is a fact. But trying lower amounts didn't put enough into milk compared to the 6,400. So that is an example of her diet, supplementing her diet, providing an adequate amount of vitamin D. And one of the things that may be going on here is we are indoor people now, and our vitamin D status is different if we're outdoor people. And so people normally with skin exposure to the sun, you make vitamin D, and so your vitamin D status may be higher, but we're different, right? We have a different lifestyle now. So our milk doesn't make enough, doesn't contain enough vitamin D unless mom has a good source of it. Has enough for her, not enough for the infant. In the case of vitamin B12, if she takes large doses, it's still going to have, maybe the amounts go up, but it doesn't matter. There's enough in there to meet the needs of the infant, and it doesn't matter. With respect to vitamin D, it does matter. She has to have enough in order to get the milk high enough in vitamin D.
okay, that makes sense. The body just kind of regulates that, and there's a cap, and then it just gives the baby what it needs. That's awesome.
Cool questions. Thank you. So I'm gonna, let's see. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna do a new share.
I just wanted to ask something for clarifying.
Please stop.
So is this strictly for those that are breastfeeding and not on formula?
Yeah, this lecture that we're talking about right here is specifically for breastfeeding. Okay, so this is about breastfeeding, period. When we, after this lecture, we'll talk about infant formula. All right, and I'll show you what the difference is between breast milk and infant formula. Okay, and basically with infant formula, they add adequate amounts of all these nutrients, so then the supplements aren't needed. So infant formula has extra iron in it. It has it has enough vitamin D in it for the infant. So but that's still a supplement, right? The formula is a big supplement, right? It's all made from added ingredients, right? So the human milk is just low naturally in vitamin D. Does that answer? You got any? Want to talk about anything else? I like the questions.
Seems like taking a multivitamin, you'll get all of these vitamins that we just discussed. In terms of a prenatal vitamin, is there just a higher dosage of each of these vitamins?
Yeah.
And is there more of a difference other than that? Are there more vitamins in a prenatal vitamin that we haven't covered?
Prenatals, we'll talk about that when we get to pregnancy, and they do recommend after pregnancy, if you're lactating, to continue to take the prenatal vitamins. And what they have specific nutrients like 800 micrograms of folic acid and probably 250 milligrams of DHA, and they have certain components in it that are known to be important for pregnancy that are sometimes missing in the diet. So yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we go. Did you guys, are y'all getting my emails that say,
Yes.
here's the lecture?
Yeah.
Yes.
Things like that. Okay, if you're not, I sent it 2 ways. I sent an email through Canvas, and then I posted an announcement, because I'm not sure which ones you're more likely to see. If anybody's not getting these, please tell me later. Write me right after this and say, I'm not getting your announcements, and I can help you figure out what to do to make sure you're getting them, because these matter. I'm going to do things like remind you when things are due, and I would like to be fair to everybody on this. Okay, so the next lecture, the second lecture on breastfeeding, gets into some more practices about breastfeeding and also about recommendations. And this is kind of a fun lecture to think about here too. It's different approach. Okay, so where do I get this information? Okay, the important sources, and if you look at the module, I have these all listed for you. There are important sources that provide position papers that are accepted by the medical community about breastfeeding. So there's an Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has a position paper, and my reading of all these papers is incorporated into these lectures. So there's also family physicians position, and then this article right here, American Academy of Pediatrics, the breastfeeding and the use of human milk. This is probably the most often cited article about supporting breastfeeding ever. And I know it's old. I keep waiting for them. These things expire, and I keep waiting for a new one. The last one before this was 2008. They haven't published a new one yet, so we still use this. And then also, if you want to find valid information, also go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I looked over all of these sites too before designing the final lecture to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Okay, so here's some statements just to kind of get us going. This is from the breastfeeding use of human milk, which I just talked about. Breastfeeding human milk are the normative standards. Given the documented short and long-term medical neurodevelopment advantages, infant nutrition should be considered a public health issue and not only a lifestyle choice. In other words, this is not a trivial decision. These are similar, so I'm not going to read all of them to you, but they all say something about this being normal, and that there are risks associated with not consuming human milk, such as increased rates of infant and maternal mortality, morbidity and mortality. So both infant and mom do better, and healthcare costs are lower if breastfeeding occurs. I'll support this in the lecture today. It's pretty interesting. Okay, another one, it's talking about being a physiological norm. They recommend that all babies, with rare exceptions, be breastfed and receive expressed human milk exclusively for the first 6 months of life. So these are the recommendations. And I have this link for you. They have lots of information about breastfeeding. And again, they talk about it being an optimal practice. And that's why the government has put a lot of money into supporting breastfeeding women. Not enough, right? We don't have a family leave and things like that, but at least there's been initiatives to try to help with education process and initiatives in the hospital, which I'll talk about. So this was a question last time, how long? And these are the statements by different organizations for how long to breastfeed. American Academy of Pediatrics says exclusively for 6 months, continue for at least a year, as long as mutually desired. 1 year and as long as mutually desired. So at least a year, and then keep going if you want to. It's personal choice. But at around 6 months, food needs to be offered. And I'm going to talk about this a lot. This is one of my areas of research. You don't want to wait past 6 months because there's not enough iron, for example, in human milk to make it after 4 to 6 months. And so the infant's risk for iron deficiency anemia goes up. So we want to, and you also, they're ready. They're ready to eat. Their mouths are ready. They need to learn about spoons. They need to learn that coordination involved. So, you want to exclusively for 6 months and then get going. World Health Organization, remember we talked last time about developing countries, it's a lifesaver, so they extended duration to 2 years or beyond, as long as desirable. And then the Academy of Pediatrics endorses this as well. Okay, I want you to bear with me here because I want to teach you something about breastfeeding research. Okay, so we asked some questions last time, such as, does breastfeeding affect intelligence, the cognitive function, right? Does breastfeeding, I mentioned breastfeeding and the effect on obesity. There are benefits of breastfeeding, but I want you to know how hard it is to study. There's lots of studies, but they're hard to design properly. Now let me explain this. So it's difficult to make absolute statements about breastfeeding because the studies are hard to design. Number one, this is very interesting. There's not enough exclusive breastfeeding in the country to serve as a natural comparison. Right now, the proportion of people that breastfeed exclusively till 6 months is very low, below 20%. Okay, and most people breastfeed for a little while, and then by 3 months they're already adding formula, and so we're not very compliant with these guidelines. So we don't have this natural population that we can look at and compare, people within that group. And then also, families who breastfeed may have other characteristics that affect their health outcomes. And what that means is, let's say I want to determine if breastfeeding affects performance in math in school in 5-year-olds. Is there a correlation? That would be an outcome of breastfeeding. Does it improve math skills? So you would want to look at a group of people that breastfed, a group of kids that were breastfed, and a group of kids that weren't breastfed, and compare their math skills. Thing is, that's not a very good study design because there's other factors in families who breastfeed that may also affect math skills. For example, people who breastfeed are more likely to have higher income. They're more likely to have that kind of time. There's also a correlation with increased education among breastfeeding families. So this breastfeeding is a health disparity, and this is something that needs to be fixed, but people that breastfeed already have a lot of things going for them. So the kids may have better math outcomes just because the family's got a higher education and more resources. Does that make sense? It's not, you can't say it's just the breastfeeding, you don't know what it is if the outcomes are different because we don't have a good control and experimental group here. And also, you can't do the kind of study that you could do with, I don't know how you feel about animal studies, that's not the point here, but in animal studies, you can divide the animals into 2 groups and give one group one treatment and another group another treatment, and they can be genetically identical. And then you can determine if those treatments have an effect because you can control the whole thing. Can you control whether or not infants are breastfed or formula fed? Somebody say no.
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 Thank you. Okay, you can't, right? Thank you. So it's unethical, and I'm going to explain something on this next slide. Then it's unethical to study breastfeeding outcomes with what's called a randomized controlled trial. That's a gold standard. This is the design of studies that actually tell us what we want to know. And we can't do this kind of study with breastfeeding individuals. And the next slide will explain why. Okay, first, I'm going to show you how a randomized controlled trial would work if we wanted to do this. Okay, so first, here's our population of interest. Let's say we want to enroll all pregnant women in San Marcos. That's our population, is pregnant women in San Marcos. And so we'd have to get a list of all of them. We'd have to figure out who they are and identify them. We'd have this big long list. And this is if we're to do this right. This is how a randomized controlled trial is done. They're very expensive to do. This is how we know things. So then you would take all of the women, let's say there's 1,000, I doubt there's that many pregnant people, but let's say there were, and you divide them into 2 groups. The deal is, when you divide them into 2 groups, to do the study right, you randomly split them into 2 groups. So that means if you have a list of 100 people or 1,000 people, a random number generator puts 1 in one group and 1 in another like this. That way you're not selecting a certain type of person for one group or another. So what that means is this group, for example, wouldn't have more education. And this group wouldn't have a higher risk for obesity. These characteristics would be, or higher incidence of obesity. These characteristics would be the same in both groups. So you get matched groups. And then you divide them into 2 groups. Okay, these are pregnant women. Okay, we tell them, okay, as soon as you have your baby, you're going to be in the breastfeeding group for 6 months. And then these guys, we're going to call you the formula feeding people. And as soon as your babies are born, you're going to all formula feed them. Now, we can't let them choose what they want to do because then it wouldn't be a study. This controls for their bias as to whether they wanted to breastfeed or they wanted to formula feed first. So you're controlling this. You can do this in a rat study. You can take rats and let them nurse with the mom or give them artificial formula and decide what to do. You can't do it with people because it's unethical. So then, but let's say you could do this, then you would compare the outcomes. So where we're talking about, are the kids smarter in age 5? Are they better at math? Well, our hypothesis is that breastfeeding improves cognitive function, they'd be better at math. Right? Does that make sense? So if we could design a study like this, we could actually find out if breastfeeding is associated with math scores. But we can't design them because you can't tell people how to feed their kids. And if they select their own selves, group A, just people in here say, well, I'm going to breastfeed, and they select their own group. And these guys, I'm going to formula feed. These aren't matched with each other. It's no longer random. Okay, so if this seems confusing, it's okay. What it means, though, is what I want you to understand is that it's hard to do human studies. They're very expensive, and it's hard to control behavior. So because you can't control it, we have to rely on other kinds of studies that aren't so perfect. Again, randomized controlled trial. You've probably seen this before, RCT. Have y'all had research yet? Have y'all had the research class?
I'm currently taking it.
Okay, she'll talk about that in there as well. So this is a particular kind of trial you'll hear about. It's really cool, but it's hard to do with breastfeeding. Okay, so in summary, this is rats. In summary, what I want you to get is that this research is not, I shouldn't say not possible, not easy to conduct for breastfeeding. So we can't have wonderful trials very often. There are a few of them out there. But so we're a little vague about the benefits of breastfeeding. It doesn't mean we don't know a lot. Here's how we do know.
And I have a comment / question.
Yeah.
Isn't there just been overall inconsistencies in the ability to measure one's quote intelligence or cognitive response as it relates to being smart or less smart than another person? There's kind of that, if you test a fish's ability to climb a tree, then it's going to be, ignorant or stupid in that regard, but it's great at fishing. So how would you even go about doing the IQ test, so to speak, even after the child, is born and developed?
I love this question. Now, I'll go back to my language. What I said is it associated with math scores at age 5. I didn't say the kids were smarter. I said it associates with the scores on the test they take in math. So that's actually an outcome measure you can define. You can define their scores, right? You can take a test. You guys will take a test here. You'll have scores. They can take a test at age 5 and it's part of the study design. And we'll know how their math scores are. Does that mean they're smarter? No, it means they scored better in math. Just exactly what you're saying. Okay, so that's why when you look at the research, what are the outcomes they're looking for? And do the outcomes make sense? I really like your question because it shows that you're really thinking about this from a scientific perspective. And outcome measures are mushy, in particular, things like IQ. Now, other outcome measures are a little easier, like incidence of diabetes by the age of 30, right? That's something we can measure, assuming you can follow people for 30 years. We can measure certain things, but we can't. Something like intelligence is something called a construct, which is complicated to define. And it's difficult to say. Now, you can do IQ tests, and some people can score higher on the IQ test than others. However, that doesn't necessarily mean they're smarter. It may mean that they're better at test taking, or they've had more kinds of tests like that in their life, and so they're good at it, right? So it's kind of complicated. Does that get at your question?
And that's what I was trying to decipher between, because I think going back, they were saying that there was a correlation between higher cognitive ability with breastfeeding versus formula feeding and things of that nature. And I would want to see kind of how that study would be drawn up, or what the original question was to get at what they were actually trying to measure. Because like when you were saying math, that specifically lets me know, okay, this is in one specific area, and it's not looking at the total breadth of, quote, intelligence as a whole. It's just this one specific subject that, can be measured through, a bevy of tests that have a specific goal.
And that's a definition of good research, when you define your outcome measure and you have a way to measure it that is respected and accepted in the literature, right? So you can't just cook up something and go, I'm just going to see if you're smarter in 5 years, and we'll figure that out when we get there. You're absolutely right. It's too vague, and it doesn't give us something concrete. But the reason I brought up math scores is because that is one of the types of scores they look at down the road to see if kids that are breastfed by the age of 7, how are they doing on their math scores? Are there correlates? Another, besides breastfeeding, alcohol consumption, the mom during pregnancy, they looked at if maternal alcohol intake has an effect on kid performance later too. It's associated with behavioral issues in some cases, and with cognitive issues. We know that because some of the effects are really extreme, right? So, but that's a kinds of way you measure things. And to do it right, you come up with a set of criteria you want to measure that actually get at what you want to measure.
And then I would also wonder, after that study was conducted, if say those individuals that were being studied that initially had issues with math, if they could somehow reverse that, or some of those, those people became mathematicians or, calculus professors and things of that nature, so they actually reverted the original verdict that they were, bad at math due to the breastfeeding or the non-breastfeeding or what have you.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And that is why science is confusing and interesting at the same time. Nutritional science in particular, we typically don't have cut and dried answers. However, so we don't. However, when enough studies are done and they point to one direction, and that they have a bunch of different designs that are designed well, but maybe a correlation study between breastfeeding and risk for obesity. All right, and if the studies are done so well, they have a large sample size, they screen out issues that might be cause a problem with the study, and if they do it really well, then they can publish it, and it gets past the peer review process, published in scientific journals. Other people read those papers. They base their studies off of what they did and what they found. And so then you have a string of studies. Other people argue with their premise and set up an experiment to see if they're wrong, look at the data another way. This is how science progresses. It's really fun, but you have to have an open mind about it. And if somebody asks you, for example, does your fiber intake affect your risk for colon cancer? You can say, I don't know. The literature's gone back and forth. And so in some cases, the literature goes back and forth, but there's some things that we have enough studies where we can go, you know what, this is pretty strong data. But we don't say, absolutely, if you breastfeed for 3 months, the kid will make a 10 on the math score. We can't say absolutes. We can look at trends and we can look at statistical differences. But a term I like to use, which I won't ask you guys, but I like to use the term of preponderance of literature. And what that means is the bulk of studies support the premise. So if it has to do with cognitive function, the bulk of the studies support the premise. But in anything you look at, you're going to find studies on both sides. Another example, I'll talk about this probably when I get to pregnancy. Does a coffee intake affect risk for miscarriage? It's a good question, right? A lot of people have trouble with miscarriages, trying to figure out, should I not drink coffee? Is that a problem? This has been studied to death. I used to look it up every year just to bring it to class and explain how this year's review was different than last year's. There's no consensus. There's a general idea, maybe 200 milligrams a day of caffeine may cause miscarriage in some people, but we're not really sure. That's how much we know, because there's other potential causes for miscarriage and so on. So all we can do, and then I'm glad you're talking about this, because all we can do with our understanding of nutrition is read the literature and read well-designed papers and understand, look at this slide here is about systematic reviews. It's what a systematic review is. It's an article that's not a study. Instead, it's a compilation of all the studies about something like breastfeeding and obesity prevention, like obesity for kids in age 5. So the longer they're breastfed, the lower their risk for obesity at age 5. Is that a definable parameter outcome? Right? We know how to measure obesity in kids. We'll talk about that. So you can do that. So a systematic review looks at all the work everybody else has done, and then comes up, and they'll get their data and work on that, and then they'll come up with an answer. And they publish their methods so carefully that somebody else can do the same study and will come up with the same conclusions. So we know some things about breastfeeding because lots of studies have been done, and many systematic reviews have taken a look at that. So we can say something about child breastfeeding and child obesity. We can say something about a few things. Does that make sense? Okay, so I wanted to set this up before I talk about what we know about breastfeeding and health, so you know where we get this. So first, why do health organizations support breastfeeding? In the beginning, we read all of these statements by these bigwig organizations that are supporting breastfeeding, and it's because there's been a great deal of research, not many randomized controlled trials, but a great deal of research that has looked into infant health outcomes, maternal health outcomes, benefits for families, and benefits for societies. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk about these. What do we know about breastfeeding and infant health? Do we know enough? Well, here's a slide. This is taken from the literature that I showed you in the beginning. It was a systematic review, and this is pretty much what we know. So this is infant outcomes, and this is the evidence based on science, the strength of the evidence that breastfeeding has an effect. So here is some infant health outcomes. Here's something you can count: gastrointestinal infections. Studies show that breastfeeding strongly helps prevent gastrointestinal infections. Formula-fed kids, in general, are going to have more infections. Does that make sense to everybody? There's been enough science. Now, this doesn't mean every single breastfed kid will never have an infection, because that's not how that works. We're looking at the preponderance, right? They have fewer. Okay, respiratory infections, the same thing. Breastfed kids are less likely to get sick with that type of thing. SIDS stands for Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. Y'all familiar with that? This is one of those heartbreaking things there is, where people put their infant to bed and go in and they die at night, sudden infant death. This is what stopped us from using bumpers and cradles and cribs. It stopped us from having kids sleep on their stomach. You know, there's been this whole back to sleep campaign, so kids sleep on their back and not have any blankets in the bed and all this type of thing. Because apparently when kids would put their face down against a pillow or something like that, then they would start breathing any more CO2, and sometimes they would stop breathing. That seems to be one theory, but we also don't understand why some kids have SIDS, but breastfeeding is protective. So fewer kids that are breastfed die from SIDS. Okay, another condition that we pretty comfortable with is a condition I'm going to show you on a picture in 2 slides. There's a condition, and this is a terrible condition, called necrotizing enterocolitis. Premature infants are commonly get this. Okay, so not commonly, okay, there's a premature infants are at risk of getting this. If they get it, their risk for death is very high. So this is a high risk situation when a child is born prematurely. I think I mentioned last time where breast milk is real important for survival of premature infants, but I'm going to go into this a little bit more. So we know breast milk's critical. And so that's why premature infants get either they get mom's milk or they get a prescription for human bank milk to help protect them. We've mentioned this with the HMOs. And also the data on overweight and obesity is good. I've used this as an example a lot. So kids that are breastfed, the longer they're breastfed, the less likely they are to get overweight. Can they still get overweight? Yes, but they're less likely to. And then there's some other conditions where the data is not quite as strong, but it's still there. Dermatitis, type 1 diabetes, some of the cognitive development that we've talked about, asthma, and also comorbidities of excess weight are things like type 2 diabetes. So what we can say by looking at this slide is that there's strong evidence that breastfeeding protects against these conditions based on the preponderance of papers and systematic reviews. And we can say that there's evidence of a relationship between these situations and breastfeeding, but it's not completely conclusive. There's just some strong evidence. That makes sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, somebody, for saying this. I appreciate it. All right, so this is the same kind of table, but this is for maternal outcomes. This is the evidence. Her health is affected by whether or not she breastfeeds. And this is really interesting. Postpartum hemorrhage. People actually, this is really sad, people that have COVID during pregnancy now are more likely to hemorrhage at birth. So that's just an aside. But if mom breastfeeds her child, she's less likely to hemorrhage. This happens on the table. If the baby is put to the breast right after birth, the baby starts nursing. I talked about this last time with oxytocin, how that causes contraction of the uterus. So it helps cause the uterus to get back to its normal size and stop her from bleeding out. Okay, so it helps with that. Also, this is a fun one. For those of you who have been fortunate enough to be female and menstruated a good bit of your life, there's a delay in ovulation. So if she breastfeeds every 2 to 3 hours until the baby spreads it out a little bit more, the first couple, 3 months, if the baby's getting all of his nutrition from breastfeeding, then she's liable not to ovulate for several months. Some people can go past a year, and when they're not ovulating, they're not having periods. So that's great because periods aren't fun. And then it's also great because it helps her restore her iron status. Okay, so if she wants to have another kid later, she has this like protective time where she's not bleeding so much. So these are important benefits. And I want to highlight some of these others. Just because they're not in the strong evidence, there's evidence. Okay, infant bonding is one. This doesn't mean people don't bond to their infant if they formula feed. That would be a ridiculous statement. But this seems to be a correlate. The breastfed mothers do a little better with that. Her risk for breast cancer and ovarian cancer may be decreased the longer she breastfeeds. So in other words, if she has 5 kids in her life and breastfeeds each of them for a year, that's 5 years of breastfeeding compared to someone that formula feeds, right? There's a real difference, and it may have to do with what happens with the development of the breast tissue. And so forth. And in some cases, it may help her with weight status, but don't get crazy about this because a lot of people, when they're lactating, they're so hungry. They just have trouble, like, watching their diet and keeping it down, and they have trouble with activity because they have a newborn. And it takes a little while to recover. So this isn't cut and dried on this. Any comments about this table? Okay, so this is benefits for mom. Now, what about families and society? I'm going to go off on this a little bit. Let's look at families first. By free, I mean breastfeeding is free. Feeding an infant formula for a year, depends on what you buy, what country, how much it eats, but is about $3,000 a year. In today's world where no one has rent, that's serious. So, so free is important. You may not be aware of this, but remember how there's fewer respiratory infections and fewer gastrointestinal infections? There's fewer doctor visits. Okay, so breastfeeding decreases medical care costs, not for the family, and then also for the society at large. And surprisingly, the kids are less likely to get sick, so they can still go to daycare. If mom can continue breastfeeding, she's not going to lose so much time at work. So it actually benefits the household income. Okay, breastfeeding does. And also, you know, people aren't sick all the time and have the emotional stress. It's interesting to have this written here during the time of COVID because we're all having emotional stress about that. But, so anyway, so that's one of the benefits for families. For society, people are more productive, so fewer people missing work, lower healthcare costs, and here's some numbers if you want to take a look, but reduced impact on the environment. I posted an article about this. If you have any interest in sustainability, I know some people do, read the article on formula. None of these articles are hard to read, and they're very interesting and how formula affects, formula manufacturing affects the environment. You think about, I just think I mentioned this last time, but if you think about all the cows, all the dairy equipment, all the water that's used, all the pollution that's used from that, all of the, and cow milk by itself is just the base for this. There's all kinds of chemicals that go into it, manufacturing of vitamins, manufacturing of palm oil, and different types of oils that cause problems with environmental contaminations. And then trucking stuff. So there's there's industry, and then the stuff gets trucked all over the country. And if it's trucked with water, then that's causes carbon footprint is as out of control. So we have a situation here. We could completely avoid all of this if more people breastfed. It would save so much money and so much of the environment. Okay, so this is just a quick look at formula issues. I just want to throw it in here. I'm going to talk about it some more, but it matters within the context of this discussion on breastfeeding. Formula is marketed internationally, and everything I'm saying here is critical. Okay, these look like just little lines on a page, but it's marketed internationally, including in developing countries with low water quality, and in the US. And how formula has been marketed in the US historically is by giving away free formula when people have a baby, giving them a little ice chest with the formula name on it, giving them coupons. Once you get them away from breastfeeding, then the formula has got $3,000 from you coming that year. So it's a very, very lucrative industry. And internationally, the formula industry is responsible for 800,000 infant deaths per year. Why? Primarily because of this. They market on purpose to people in countries that don't have access to clean water. Once they start feeding infants formula with contaminated water, then they develop dysentery and die. Okay, so this is, the formula industry has had a bad reputation for many years. This is where the term the ugly American came from a long time ago, because people went in, these companies went in and marketed to women in developing countries. Okay, so I mentioned it's expensive and the environmental devastation. But if you're